face currently.
Yeah.
And we wanted to have, this time, you know, we had yesterday a lot of scientists and we had breathing, and we wanted to have an architect this time. We said, what is the, because we will live in the cities. What is the architecture? What is the architecture of participation? The future of the cities, are they done with people, not with people? How do we want to live? How they're integrated? And so we found Rem Koolhaas. You know, Rem Koolhaas is a very famous architect. And Reinier is partner and responsible for OMA, which is the Office of Metropolitan Architecture. And they work all around the world, Reinier. You work everywhere. You work for Sustainable Carbon-Free Europe. You worked, and you will show these examples. So what is this architecture by us, Reinier, for us, with us, whatever, how the architects work with people. So it's with the masses. Reinier, welcome. And he came with Jeremy, his also partner. Yeah, okay.
He's my colleague.
Colleague.
I mean, before
For
we
the
are
day, for the day.
for the day. I mean, before we are partners, we are people. So,
Yes.
I mean, that's the
okay.
quintessential message. I've called my talk "With the Masses," which may not be very original to you, but for architects, for architects, it definitely is original, because we only know the phrase, the very militant phrase, "for the masses," but "with the masses" is a relatively recent thing. Like you, we've been watching the news, and in the news, the masses manifest themselves very, very violently, very, very forcefully, but most visibly always in a state of protest, in a state of opposition. You all know this, Taksim Square in Istanbul, similar scenes in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, a state of protest. Not seldomly, protests get out of hand, trigger a reaction from government, often an oppressive reaction. This is slum clearance enforced by the police in Brazil. Violent scenes. We all know essentially the images that reached the news. And the interesting thing is that this last image is actually a blazing surprise. It is not in Brazil, it is in Sweden. The last country where one would actually expect a kind of violent protest against a government, because that is not the stereotypical perception of what Sweden is or Sweden warrants. What for us is a rather daunting realization is that somehow, somewhere, all these protests have something to do with architecture. Or at least have construction activity, often maybe not as the deeper cause, but very often as an immediate cause of why people are angry. People are angry about plans for a new shopping mall at Taksim Square, as you know, part of, let's say, a construction wave of new development, commercial development that is engulfing the city of Istanbul. In Rio, it's similar. There are, of course, big stadiums built for the World Cup. At the expense of residential neighborhoods, however poor and unequipped these residential neighborhoods may be. And even in the case of Sweden, there is a link. It is not a protest against an impending wave of construction. It is somehow a dissatisfaction against an architecture and a mentality from the past. This is Husby, a new satellite town built in the 1960s north of Stockholm. And interestingly enough, we did a little bit of research into this area. It was an area planned at one point with great care and a great deal of ideology, actually a very benign ideology which put people at the center. Essentially, with an architecture that is carried out with a lot of care, an architecture that at the time in the late 60s even engaged in a public debate very, very openly, an architecture that wrote manifestos. This is a Team 10 manifesto, where in a way the claims of architecture towards humanism were supposed to rival sociology. The appropriateness of any solution in the field, it may lie in the field of architectural invention rather than in social anthropology. So a kind of blatant confidence where essentially the composition of building was intended as an immediate translation of the relationships between people. Naive as it was, idealistic, it was also another famous credo for that movement, by us, for us, but I guess the people that live in Husby rather have the feeling of for us, without us. And this is a very important thing, because whatever the effect of this architecture was in the long run, it nevertheless had a mentality that was idealistic, which meanwhile gets lost. This is a building of the Turkish government, which, you know, given the fact that the riot police is in front of it, is in a way a symbol of oppression. But this is a competition entry of a dear colleague of ours, which in terms of mentality is almost eerily close to this symbol. A competition entry of a glossy building flanking the Turkish flag. A new stadium in Brazil as a kind of symbol of national pride at a very moment that that symbol is under a great amount of criticism. So contemporary architecture, and this is in a way not even excluding ourselves, may find cause in these events to have a very, very critical introspection. The dollar sign actually across the flag, a very telling thing. This is a symbol we use a lot in our work. Essentially the symbol that represents a world in which all overt ideologies have ended and in which economic values are the last and only remaining field in actually around which a kind of global consensus is built. So as I said before, we had architectural ideology. This is Corbusier in 1925, and whatever you think of this image and however much this type of architecture has been discredited, the architecture that has replaced it, which is the architecture of the free market, which we now see anywhere, may have distanced itself from the ideology, but the imagery is not that different. More interestingly enough, this is an image not made by an architect. This is an image that is the cover of a McKinsey report on the future of Mumbai. Interesting at best. But anyway, I think we would like to think that this public outroar is rather against stuff like this. But of course, what we see in Sweden is that essentially the manifestos of the more honorable members of the architecture profession are now also vastly discredited. If you look at the production of architectural books and books about the city, you sort of see a concentrated wave that miraculously stops in the early 1970s. That was the moment somehow the architectural profession stopped writing books, stopped being ideological, rather joined the market forces. And in that same period, something else has happened. If these are the largest cities of the world in 1970, predominantly Western cities, these are the largest cities 50 years later, pending. Tokyo is in a way the only Western or rich city in that list. The cities are enormous, and the cities are largely in the developing world. So what you see is that there is a wave of urban growth going around the world, happening precisely at a moment that the architectural profession stopped thinking or stopped being ideological, and that therefore probably the biggest wave of urban growth in history happens in a theoretical vacuum. And we all know that an overdose of ideology is dangerous, but you can legitimately ask whether an underdose of ideology isn't infinitely more dangerous. Cities grow, and whether or not we plan them, they grow. This is an example, Lagos, a city founded by the British in Nigeria, with an infrastructure very carefully planned, but however with a population that is in the meantime about 10 or 20 times bigger than what the infrastructure was planned for. The result is kind of obvious. The city becomes a syndrome, and the city has to survive in an incredible regime of improvisation. This is a very large highway intersection. It's also the largest second-hand car market in Africa. This is, well, a traffic jam. I guess, but it's very smart in the sense that there's a situation of so much congestion that I think the end of the morning peak coincides with the beginning of the afternoon peak, which means that the traffic jam is stable, continuous, and in a way the traffic jam becomes a car park. So if the traffic can't travel to commerce, commerce travels to traffic. And in a way, you could regard this as a traffic jam, but if you watch closely, this is an enormous open-air market. So, perversely, perversely, the apocalypse of dysfunctionality is also the apocalypse of genius in a kind of very weird way. So, interesting. Let's look at cities more in general. A map of the world categorized according to GDP. White is high GDP. The darker it gets, the lower your GDP. Africa is some parts of Africa are non-existent on this map. This is where the cities are growing. And what you see is that the fastest growing cities in the world happen in a condition of a low GDP. The fastest growing cities in the world are still in some of the most deprived parts of the world. And in a very, very weird way, cities themselves have become entrepreneurial tools. Cities are a way of getting richer. A very silly example, income in China, urban disposable rural income. Simply, the more urban dwellers you have, in theory, the higher your economic output. So cities are also a vehicle very much to generate GDP, with very mixed results, because you see that what that leads to is that the more established cities do not grow in terms of population, but they grow in GDP. And in effort to catch up, cities in the developing world, part of some of them manage that they have their GDP growing quicker than their people, but some of them are also in a situation where in an effort to generate economic output, they simply have ever larger population numbers. So, in a way, if 1978 is the year of China's open door policy, and in a way the introduction of the global free market, we see that the world GDP per capita has risen spectacularly. But in that same period, somehow the concentration of wealth, even though it grew in absolute terms, was concentrated in the hands of ever fewer people, which means that the city, as an aspirational model, as a model for economic development, as in a way to get richer, as a kind of unintended byproduct, that with the success of the city, also the other half of the city grows at spectacular rate. There's another aspect to this. Not only do the fastest growing cities happen in a state of relative economic poverty in places, they also happen in a very particular political context. This is the way, and whenever I show this map, somebody in the audience always gets offended. But I mean, I apologize for any inaccuracies in advance. It's about the general principle. These are our political views. There is blue. That's democratic, that's where you have elections. There is red, that is non-democracies, I will say it politely, that's where you don't have elections. But then there's an increasingly successful category which is yellow, which is places where you have elections, but you know the outcome in advance. A kind of managed democracy, which is also actually a perfect model for urban planning. Strangely enough, this is Dubai, 1990. This is Dubai, 2003. Even meanwhile, 10 years later, this picture is also already hopelessly out of date, because this stuff is now also immediately adjacent. Nothing in this picture is older than 10 years. Nevertheless, it's a city of an enormous size and an enormous urban momentum. It's also a city that is an entirely artificial construct. It is built to attract people. It is not built for people that are there. Dubaians are an ethnic minority in their own city. I think almost half of when this would be true, almost half or more than half of the population would be living on artificial islands in the sea. So it's also become independent of its own geography. But very interestingly is in a way the governing model. it is not because of local dress that the right column looks similar to the left column. It is simply the fact that those who govern are also the most prominent businessmen in the country, property developers. But here, I mean, business interests are a prerequisite to be in government, so they don't have a separation of powers, they have a perfect alignment of powers, to the point that actually a city or a city-state morphs into a corporation. That model, you know, dubious as it may be, is also phenomenally successful. Because until recently, Dubai's property developers actually exported its urban model to places as diverse as Algeria, to Indonesia and the Philippines. Something similar is now the case for Singapore, where Singapore is the name of a place, but Singapore is also the name of a particular type of knowledge that claims how to create livable cities, and that claims that it can be a very successful mix between planning and governance of cities. Even as in a form of debate, the Lee Kuan Yew University with the Associate Prize with Mayor Bloomberg, and an expert of that model to particular cities in China, which are created from scratch. That is still government of sorts, but I think what is more radical is that the development of the city now takes place in a context where everywhere the public sector is rendering more and more of its responsibilities to the market. So the examples go on. We all know that Bechtel is a kind of ersatz government in some places where they work. But also IKEA, from a furniture maker, is now also an urban planner and a very interesting rival for us, even in London. Did you ever dream of an entire city filled with Swedish meatballs and DIY furniture? That dream could soon be a reality. There you go. Strand East, urban planning by IKEA. Yeah, well, yeah, for sure.
That would have on the divorce rates, you know, flat pack and...
Well, yeah, but I mean, the internet, I think, sort of perfectly compensates for the divorce. Anyway, this is Siemens, a German technology giant, which now also claims to have such a wide expertise of technology that they can simply replace governments and simply replace urban planners and almost deliver instant cities, which of course will have a complete package of Siemens technology. So their proposal is essentially always also an entrepreneurial bid in essence. There you go, Siemens. Of course, all of this doesn't always go down well as smoothly. There have been protests to Bechtel, which have been rife. But I was also wondering, when putting together this talk, whether the protests we have seen in the places that I started with have something to do ultimately with this phenomena. Because what for me is very, very weird is that in each protest, you see the flag. You never know whether they are protesting against the flag or whether the flag is actually mobilized in support of something they are unhappy about. So are they protesting against the government? Or is this a final desperate call on governments to kind of give them a certain amount of control over their own destiny in a globalized world where things seem to be decided at fault? Let's take a look at this. GDP of Australia and Sweden, countries. Let's look at this, Mexico City and Sao Paulo. They have larger GDP, certain cities have larger GDPs than countries at the moment. Take a look at this, big corporations, Shell and Walmart, who have larger GDPs than cities, which in turn have larger degree of GDP than countries. Nevertheless, our whole system of power, we vote for our national governments. Sometimes we vote for mayors. In the Netherlands, we don't. We very rarely vote who is our CEO. So there is, and sooner or later, the numbers are going to topple the balance of power here. It's where the largest numbers flock. Actually, the least kind of institutional democracy or participation or co-sayship is often existing. And there is a very weird marriage between the megacities in the world and that type of economy. So they first larger mega, 3% of the Earth's surface, 66% of economic activity, 85% of scientific innovation. They hold so many cards that I wonder whether we're not facing another inconvenient truth than the inconvenient truth we are already facing. We are facing, in a way, not just the flooding of low territories, we are facing the gradual dissolution of nation state in terms of power. This is the world. This is population of more than 25 persons per square kilometer, more than 50, more than 125. And these are the megacity region, where to some extent, I think currently a little over 50% of the world lives in cities. If you extrapolate that trend, maybe by the end of this century, it'll be close to 100. And the city will be all we have left, which in a very weird way might call for a world map, a political world map, where the international community is not the UN, it's actually an association of mega regions which somehow need to enter a kind of multipolar relationship with each other and also guarantee a certain amount of democracy that is aligned with the numbers rather than fighting the numbers. It made us think of a kind of pre-national state, the city-states in ancient Greece, which of course in Greek are called polis. That word city is intimately linked to politics. I mean, they derive from the same thing. So if currently we are having the megalopolis, it is time for a kind of revenge of governance and people empowerment in the form of megalopolitics, which is a kind of copyrighted term. Again. We've developed the term. We don't know what it is. We are in a process of trying to elaborate what it is. But the term is first and foremost a cry out for a new alignment of people's participation in an economic reality that without that participation is happening by default and giving a clear amount of dissatisfaction. We are called the Office for Metropolitan Architecture. We, in a way, started our office with Rem Koolhaas in the 70s over a fascination in New York. But meanwhile, we've worked in very, very many cities, transversed into China. Of course, that was both a building project, but at the same time, an extremely political endeavor. It's one of many projects we have. The vast majority of the life of an architect is that about 25% of what he designs gets built. The rest doesn't. It gets prematurely aborted or whatever. So in a way you could say that 75% of our life is dedicated to the virtual. In order to deal with that, and that you can also clearly see that this is a series of terms in architecture. Architect, arena, blueprint, platform, they are almost all of them are architectural elements. At the same time, each of these is more known for its metaphorical meaning, its conceptual meaning, than for its literally architectural meaning. So we founded AMO, which is in a way a company that dedicates our thinking, well, the stuff that I showed, I guess, dedicates architectural thinking to a domain other than building, which is in a way a company dedicated to ideas. And as a brief kind of introduction afterwards, we've designed a European flag that gets more beautiful the more members join. We developed a kind of map for Europe, where the European Union isn't a set of member states, but a series of energy regions named after the most predominant energy source they have, so by a global network. And like that, our last thing is actually a theorization of ourselves, where architects barely worked abroad until 1980. Architects now work all over the world and in a way contribute to architecture, but also contribute to the disappearance of a type of architecture, in the sense that if until 1940 there was still national architecture, currently we have this, which is of course closely related to kind of what is happening as a convergence that we're seeing in politics. This last thing is the topic of the Architectural Biennale, which we're curating in 2014, which is about absorbing modernity, and where the different countries who participate are solicited to write a common history about architecture and modernity. That's it. Thank you.
All right, questions? What's about participation there?
Yeah, what about it? No, but what I said in the beginning,
Yeah.
I mean, our profession is very top-down and relatively virgin in terms of participation, but I think also our profession runs a serious risk of being run by. Sorry?
Yeah, my question was, are you seeing a big movement to open source in architecture like in other fields?
No.
There's not
Actually-
amateur designers coming in and
Actually, not really. There were some very fragile attempt in the 70s also to involve residents in co-designing buildings with mixed results, and I think they were interesting as efforts. Often the architecture is regarded as somewhat quaint and frowned upon by even respectable architects. What you see currently is that there are, for instance, in the Netherlands, a number of cities where cities sell land, not the property developers who hire an architect to build big housing projects, but they send individual plots of land directly to citizens who then hire an architect, or they build a catalogue home, or they design one themselves. So also there is a situation that architecture is almost a dinosaur profession that is partly running in an offside trap, and reality passes its by. So I see citizen participation happening in the city. Unfortunately, I see that converging with a diminishing role for architects, which I think is fodder for thought for us.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
Interesting, the comment on something, actually, and that is that there's a lot of school of thought there that says actually the move towards urbanisation is actually a positive move for sustainability, because urban living is actually a much more sustainable solution if it's joined up in terms of resource management. I think that's why companies like Siemens and others are getting involved. You have any comments on that?
I think in theory that's true. In reality, it often isn't. I mean, there is ample stats that actually urbanites contribute way more to pollution than rurals. I think there's something very, very complex happening. In the 50s, we had suburbanization. People got a lot wealthier, and apparently when people got wealthy, they chose to leave the city. And the city was a sign of poverty, of congestion, of pollution. So people moved away from the city. Currently, people flock back to the city, but it's largely for reasons of economic opportunity. It's not yet coinciding with a real embrace of urban qualities, at least not by everyone. So what you see is that people flock back to the city, but as long as they don't embrace urban qualities of concentration, density, mixed use, etc., I think the city will not be able to deliver on the promise of sustainability that is, of course, inherent to some of its features. So people go back to the city, but they go back for completely different motives than an embrace of the city. And unless, yeah.
I have a question. My feeling is in some European cities, like Paris where I live, that there is a tendency from politicians also to give back the city to the people. Vélib, for example, in France, that you have bicycle, that you have more parks, that last week part of the Seine has been opened for public and not for cars anymore. So the cities are coming for people back and not for the car industry. Do you see this movement happening in some other areas also with the urbanization?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it happens massively in cities, which in terms of problems are not on the top of the global list.
Yeah.
But I definitely see it happening. What I think is happening is that what could happen is that the same opportunities the city in theory has towards sustainability, it also has towards democracy. Because cities are smaller, they have fewer inhabitants. In theory, there is a more direct connection possible to those who represent us and to those who govern us. So in theory, there an embrace of the city could also spell a kind of political renaissance of a more direct participatory democracy. Unfortunately, the reality, if you look at places like Dubai and many big cities, also that reality isn't yet happening.
First, your question.
when I overlay the phenomenon of aging in some of these mega cities against rapid urbanization, I think a lot of people get worried about how much unfriendlier it becomes for for aging populations. And one of the debates in the UK, for instance, is how people who are of a certain age who have built up houses probably need to relocate to free up houses for emerging families since they're empty nesters. Do you have some thoughts on that?
I think it's a very complex thing because I think it's very similar to kind of discussions we have about pensions in Western societies, where people who have built up something on a principle of solidarity, at the moment they are in a position to actually reap the rewards of what they build up, are asked to expand the solidarity principle to so many other people that the very fruits of their earlier solidarity for them are seemingly evaporating. And I think this is an enormously difficult issue that warrants a kind of careful choreography that neither one of those loses out. I don't have an answer, but I see what you're saying, and
are we seeing anywhere, so it's hard to deny the city thing, but are we seeing anywhere of the reverse trend? So the internet and the connectivity, you don't have to necessarily gather in the city in order to do the work. Is there anywhere where we're seeing the reverse as population's exploding and people are going to occupy all of the space at some point? But are you seeing it anywhere or not?
yeah, well, there's Switzerland is an interesting example of a kind of rebirth of the rural, and the Netherlands is an interesting rebirth of the rural, in the sense that sort of the people that live in traditionally Dutch farms often look anything but Dutch. The activity they indulge in, often has very little to do with farming, but apparently a farm is an ideal place to organize certain events. No, but of course.
The next big
But of course, the notoriety of the internet, or the notoriety that the internet in theory provides, leads to a situation where anything can happen anywhere. There is an interesting Russian definition of the city, which is the only definition in the world which is not based on density. It's based on activity. So the moment a farm becomes a sex farm, and I will not elaborate any more than that, it also has become city. Also the area, the lands around it, technically qualify as city. And I think if you were to, for instance, apply that definition on the Netherlands, you would find that 85% of its territory, although it's meadows and cows, would qualify as a city. So it's a kind of, the rural is becoming urban as well. The city, at the moment of its apotheosis, often doesn't look like a city anymore, but it depends how you look at it.
Ola, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Quick. I think one after the other, and then you...
Go. Yeah, okay.
No. And then you answer, and you can say... Okay, go ahead.
So you talk a lot about how cities are looking the same, the final picture. But the vast majority of people living in cities are living in slums.
Yeah.
What's going on in the slums?
And maybe the other questions also at the same time, then you can answer.
Well, oh, sorry. What?
Go.
No, well, in the slums, an interesting process goes on. In the slum, of course, slum business goes on. In Brazil, kind of drug trade goes on, gangs rule. But at the same time, there is a certain amount, since the breakdown in confidence of a government that will deliver anything to the slum top down, there is a certain amount of like the example, the point of Lagos, I think also applies to the slum. At the moment of a kind of total breakdown and a definitive break with the faith that any kind of planning or superior hand will solve the problem, a regime of improvisation takes place, which often is very energetic and from which actually even, I think, big firms or big planners could actually learn a lot.
Yeah. Okay.
Monaco's just voted Copenhagen as the kind of the best city in the world to live in.
Yeah.
Do you have any kind of views on what is the ideal city?
Monocle, The Economist, and I think also the Financial Times have these rankings. There they reward Vancouver, Wellington, Melbourne, and I don't know. I'm not sure that that I would want any city I lived in to be amongst that list. Because yes, they maybe stand for an interesting overcoming of all the supposed problems that plagued the city at one point. They're also some of the most boring places in the world. And I mean, Copenhagen is for the record, not...
I just had a question.
Greta and David and then.
To pick your brain on that is when you see these cities in China and in Asia and the quality of life is just getting worse and worse,
Yeah.
quality of air, etc. It seems like the minute a lot of these cities and people who live there have money, they go to Europe and they go to the US. Do you see, I mean, and the only sort of exception seems Singapore, and again, you know, without any value judgment, I'm not sure people like it or not, but where do you see that going? Is there ever going to be, in the Indonesias and the Chinas of this world, people actually say, even if I have money, I want to enjoy living where I come from, rather than go to the south of France or, you know.
I think in that part of the world, of course, the cities still embody qualities which made people flee the cities, also in the West in the 1950s. And it's a kind of neck-and-neck race. I think it's very easy to speak about it like that. You must also take into account that, for instance, China, in spite of all its problems, has the most ambitious program in terms of developing renewable technologies in the world. And it's very, very important, I think, when you have this debate about places like that, to be enormously subtle and nuanced. And I think that the real story is that this is a neck-and-neck race, probably between how rapid these means of improvement develop, weighed against the impatience of those who you know, might enjoy them.
My question was in a slightly different direction, which is the impact of architecture on mood. And I'm interested if you have, talking about empowerment, any examples where you can show how different approaches to architecture have different impacts on the population that inhabit them.
I don't, in a way, and I think this kind of research is very embryonic, often carried out with a lot of ulterior motives, often somewhat dubious, which is not to say that it's not an interesting field to look into, because in the end architecture is for people, and the ultimate goal is people, and that's often forgotten. I mean, architecture generally has a very bad effect on my mood, given I mean, given all the troubles associated with getting a building built, which is like a monstrous, barbaric profession. But I mean, I think in as much as that kind of research exists, I think it's embryonic and its conclusions trivial, but I think there is a lot of value in that developing.
Okay. Well done. Thank you very much. You can stay.